Hello, so as you can see I've finally managed to finish something. Now obviously it's been a bit of a while since my last video, and this has been on a bit of a journey, as they say. This is another instance of me starting a project, ending up with one idea which I subsequently discard and then start again from scratch. So hang on, let me get this thing off. There we go. So yeah, I sort of spent about a month or so building this before deciding that I didn't like the idea at all and starting again from scratch. So this is going to be a bit of a muddled video, I think. So in this video we'll be going through the sort of creative process and the sort of journey, as they say, to get from point A to point B and finally to point C. Now I should probably say what this is, shouldn't I? This is a costume for the Lincoln Steampunk Asylum. The festival hasn't happened for a few years, obviously because of COVID, so this is the first time it's happened in about 2 years. So I wanted to do something new for it. That's the thing, each year you've got to show up with some new piece of costume or artwork or something. So I wanted to do something for it. But obviously discarding my idea halfway through left me about a month to actually put something together. So this is what I've come up with. I'm not quite sure what the idea is. As you can see, we've got some sort of Cthulhu iconography here, and as you can see in this B-roll on the legs as well. I basically threw this together out of bits of half-finished projects and a few elements that I'd made for the original piece that I started building at the beginning. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge of stuff, but I'm quite pleased with it really. You can see you've got some kind of cool like machinery bits here. And we've got some working fans in here as well, so I can actually breathe, sort of anticipating the festival being quite hot. So I think some fans is going to be quite useful. Got a bit of lighting as well. Won't be able to see that in daylight, unfortunately, but it does look quite cool indoors. So here are a few more bits of video of the costume itself. It's actually quite difficult to get some video of this at the festival. I had to get a friend of mine to actually do a little bit of video, but it's not like I can do a whole photo shoot. I guess that's the drawback of making costumes. It's quite difficult to actually video yourself wearing them, particularly here as well, because I've got some designs on my legs and on my shoulder. It's, you know, you've got to get the full figure in shot to actually show the whole thing off. So I did some video in the back garden as well, so that's what you're seeing here. So this is where I ended up, but as I mentioned, there's been quite a lot of back and forth in between to get to this point, so let's get started. So my initial idea for this was I wanted to do something maybe vaguely Warhammer 40,000 inspired. I mentioned recently that I've really got into Warhammer, and so I wanted to have something with that sort of sculptural, sort of armour-like quality to it that you see in a lot of the costumes. So I thought, well, maybe I can do something that is sort of partially inspired by 40k, but also has a bit of a steampunk feel to it. So to start off, I bought myself some EVA foam. I also got some warbler here, which is like a heat forming plastic. I've got some leather and I've got some lining paper. And the lining paper is really so I can actually build patterns of the piece and just make sure everything fits before I cut out the final sections in foam. Now the foam I've got here is something called CF150, which is from a company called Polyprops, and it's actually a lot firmer than foam that I've used previously. The previous stuff I had quite a lot of give to it, but this stuff's actually really tough, and so larger objects that you can build with it actually are pretty strong, so I was quite impressed with this stuff. So what I started to do was to make some basic patterns on the lining paper, and then to cut them out on the foam. I've always been impressed with foam about how quickly you can just build large curved shapes with it with relative ease. I mean, all you do is basically cut out the shape, give it a bit of heat from a heat gun, and that'll allow you to bend it into whatever shape you want. So it's really, really useful in that way. You can build up the basic forms of a costume pretty quickly. And so that's what I did. I started cutting out basic shapes on the lining paper and just refine them until they fit me. I can then come back in and cut those shapes out in foam. And what I want to do is sort of a high collared type thing, maybe a little bit like the Sisters of Battle armour that you see in some of the 40k artwork. There's a picture here of that. Obviously I'm not going to be a Sister of Battle, but I just like the basic look of that. I didn't want to make a Space Marine, which is the iconic look for 40k, but I wanted to do sort of a power armour type thing, and this sort of seemed like something that was a decent set of power armour, but that wasn't a Space Marine. So what I'm doing here is looking to make some shoulder pads, and what I've done is to cut out a curved template, and I'm now heat forming the shapes over a globe. This is actually something I've used before for a helmet I made some years ago, and it's just a light fitting for a bathroom. It's just a spherical shape basically, and actually handily it's about the same size as my head, so I've used this to make helmets before as well. It's just a handy little surface to work against. So I've got two curved surfaces for my shoulder pad, and I'm just using contact adhesive to glue those together. This stuff's really, really strong. It's used for gluing shoes together, I think, so I've used this stuff extensively in this project.
Okay, so there we go. So we've got a basic shape for a shoulder pad there. And throughout this project I would come back and keep trying it on. I have got a mannequin that I've been using, but it's really not quite the same as trying it on yourself and making sure things fit. So it's quite important just to keep trying these things on and making sure they work. So you can sort of see the basic idea that I have going on here. So now that I have the basic shape for my shoulder pad, what I want to do is to actually sculpt some sculptural detail over this. One of the things about 40k is that the armour is often very, very ornate and has lots of sculptural detail on it, so I want to include some of that in my project as well. So what I'm going to do is melt some of this warbler over the foam shape that I've got, and I can then come in with some monster clay and sculpt up a sort of a relief over that. I figured I would need a hard base to actually sculpt against, but having done it for a while I actually realised I probably could have sculpted directly onto the foam. So for later pieces that's what I did, but in this case I'm just using a warbler backing to sculpt against. I also gave it a layer of Bondo as well, just so I could sand that down to a smooth finish. So in order to get the basic design symmetrical, what I've done is to use a template here. I'm just going to sketch that on so I've got a basic template to work against. So now that I've got that on there, I can now come in with some monster clay and start sketching up some detail. I actually put this rake together using a broken bandsaw blade. I'd seen someone online doing this. It's quite quick to do just by putting it into this piece of brass tube. But I found this really useful just for levelling out all the various pieces of clay on the sculpture. So now that I've got that in a basic form, it's looking pretty good, so I'm going to come in and add some silicone over this to start making my mould. And what I've done is just use some aluminium tape around the edges just to create a barrier so that the silicone won't slip off the piece as I apply it. So what I'm trying to do here is just build up a layer of silicone over the piece. I'm then going to come in with some rotocasting resin and some glass fibre, and I found that's quite a good combination just to create a hard case over the sculpture. It's much more pleasant to work with than polyester resin, which is what you typically use for fiberglass, and it does dry quite quickly compared to the polyester resin, so that's quite a good way of doing it, I found. Now I'd put some cling film over the foam, so that means that I can pull this out of the mould and the foam hasn't really been damaged, so that's pretty good. Now I also want to include some mechanical detail on this piece as well. And I've got a variety of pieces here. My vacuum cleaner for the workshop actually broke recently, so I'm using some parts from that to add some mechanical detail. I've also got this, which is a CO2 canister that a friend gave me. I think it's from a life jacket, but it's quite a decent size. So what I want to do is make a mould of this so I can cast up multiple copies of it. So I've put some silicone and let that set, and I can now open up the surround and get that out. So there's my mould. Now what I've actually done is use some softer silicone than I would typically use for this. I was hoping maybe it would flex enough to allow me to free the piece without actually having to cut the mould, but I don't think it's going to be flexible enough for that, so I'm going to have to cut this to get the piece out. So I can now mix up some resin and pour that in. Now something I've learned is that if you're going to strap something to your body, straps have a tendency to slip and move as you're wearing them. So something that I found works quite well is to actually put some strips of aluminium bar in the straps or the structure to hold the piece in place. So what they can do is actually sit on your shoulders, and because they're rigid they won't move. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to create a basic form around these strips of aluminium and then build the piece on top of that. So I'm just continuing to line that basic shape with foam to come up with a basic form for the piece. And I'm thinking some of the mechanical items will sit on the back of the piece like this. I also started building up the mechanical detailing on the piece as well, so I'm adding this sort of tube around the front. And I must admit, at this point I was starting to think, you know what, I'm not really that happy with this. It wasn't exactly screaming steampunk to me, and I met up with some friends who were going to the festival a month or so prior to the festival, and sort of said, you know, what I'm doing, I'm sort of halfway through it, I'm quite into it, but I'm just not I'm not really feeling it, you know what I mean? It's not really screaming steampunk, and I'm not quite happy with the look of it. So it'd been playing on my mind for a while, but because I was sort of about a month into the build, I was just sort of persevering, you know what I mean? And I think you've got to be quite honest with yourself sometimes and recognise if something isn't working ahead of time, because obviously you can waste a hell of a lot of time if you just persevere with something you're not quite happy with. So it was around this time that I started thinking, not sure about this, but I continued nonetheless. And as you can see, I've built up some of the mechanical detailing. And actually, once I got all this on, I started thinking, oh, you know what, maybe this is okay. You know, maybe I'm sort of honing in on something that looks kind of cool. But nevertheless, that thought was lurking in my mind. So also starting to think about some shin guards, and I want to have some similar sculptural pieces on this. Now, as I mentioned, I realised once I'd done the first sculpture that I could actually just sculpt directly onto the foam, so firm enough to allow me to do that. So what I'm going to do is just put some cling film over the foam so that the clay doesn't mess it up, and I'm then going to start sculpting a design over that. The design I've gone for here is inspired by some fan art that I'd seen of the King in Yellow. I really like that look of the tentacles coming out from beneath the cloak. So I've gone with that, but I've just put a little twist and made the Queen in Yellow instead of the King in Yellow. So that's now ready, so now I can make the mould, and I'm using exactly the same process as I did before. So I then started thinking about doing some cold casting for these designs that I've sculpted up. So because it was made in foam, what I was thinking was, well, what I can do is make the cold casting using rotocasting resin rather than some of the other types of resin I've used before. That way there'll be a little bit of a flex in the resin, so as the foam moves, then the sculpture can too. Now, I hadn't tried this before, but I figured that cold casting with rotocasting resin would work much the same as any other type of resin. So what I'm doing is mixing in some brass powder into my resin here, and then pouring that into the mould and working it all over the mould to make sure I've got an even consistency throughout. I also gave it another layer of rotocasting resin on the back, which wasn't tinted, and that's just to give it a bit more strength. And initially this was looking pretty good. You know, it didn't look much different from any other piece of cold casting that I'd done previously. They always come out quite dull, and it's only once you sand them and polish them that they come up with a nice metallic shine. But once I'd done that, I started finding that this wasn't quite as shiny as I'd managed on previous pieces. So I started thinking, well, I mean, I'm going to be painting the rest of the costume anyway, so why don't on this occasion I just use some paint instead of cold casting? So that's what I started doing, and as you can see here, this stuff actually came out really, really bright, and what it is, it's a gold powder mixed with a neutral paint base. So it is metallic, kind of in the same way that the cold casting is. And initially this was looking pretty promising. I was quite happy with the finish of that. It was much more shiny than I'd managed with any previous cold casting that I'd done. But over time I started thinking that it wasn't quite as good as I initially thought. For some reason there was a bit of a reaction between the paint and the resin, so the paint never quite seemed to dry completely. It was always very slightly tacky to the touch, and although it looked kind of cool, it just it just didn't really quite seem right, you know, because if this stuff isn't going to cure, it's going to start attracting dust and all manner of other stuff if it's a bit tacky. So this is more or less where I got to when I decided to start changing my mind. As you can see, it's got quite a 40k look to it. I cast up some acorn nuts in resin, so I made a mould and just cast up a bunch in black resin. So that's what all that detailing is around the edges of the armour. And you know, it looks kind of cool, it looks quite 40k, but it wasn't really screaming steampunk to me. And so it's more or less at this point where I started thinking, okay, I need to change tack here a little bit. So that left me in a bit of a quandary, because I've been working on this for about a month, and the festival was about a month away, so I literally had 3 or 4 weekends to put together something for the festival. Now, I didn't mind that necessarily, because a deadline does tend to help focus the mind. So I started thinking that I could take pieces of previous projects that I'd worked on, so I've got quite a few half-finished things and duplicates of things I've made in the past, and I could use the sculptures that I'd already done to put those together and sort of come up with something for the festival. So that was the plan. So I abandoned this one and I started moving on to something else. So the first thing that I did was to take the casts of the pressure vessels I had and start thinking about combining them with this fire extinguisher. And this is something that's been sitting in the parts box for ages, and I've been thinking, well, I can use it for something at some point. So that was a good first start. I figured I could incorporate that into a piece. And I've made this sort of arrangement with the pressure vessels that you can see here. So I figured they could be a sort of a power unit on the back. I then decided to have another go at doing some cold casting. So this is another cast of the Shin armour piece that I've made, and I have put a greater quantity of brass powder in here, and I've used the same method I did previously as well, and this initially was looking really good, so that was quite promising. So I was then able to polish that up, and it looked like a sort of a realistic metallic piece. So I was sort of feeling a bit better after doing that. I sort of felt I was a bit more on the right track. So here's a comparison between the painted version and my cold cast version, and as you can see, while the painted version is much brighter, the cold cast version looks much more convincingly like actual brass, so I think that's the way to go. So what I've done here is to actually use the initial foam shape that I'd made, and I've covered that in fake leather, and I think that's looking a lot more authentic. The thing I came to realise with steampunk items is that the way I do them is I use real materials, I use real leather, real brass, and that can't help but look authentic because it's real materials, and the fidelity of those materials holds up even if you look at it like very, very close to the eye. It appears like a real item. And I think the problem ultimately that I had with foam was that it just didn't look real up close. Now I think that's partly my inexperience with using the material. There's a lot of cosplayers out there who get some fantastic results with it, so I think it's sort of my lack of experience really. But I've often found when I try to use foam that just that the fidelity of the finished piece just doesn't hold up to the eye. It looks okay maybe from, you know, a couple of meters away, but when you get up close you can see that it's foam, and that was, I think, what was really bothering me with it. So I figured if I could cover the pieces I'd already made with leather, that would work pretty well. So that was the approach I decided to take. So I decided to use a similar approach to put together a sort of breathing mask or gas mask. This is something I've never done, and I've seen various people at the festival were wearing them as part of their costume, but it's something I've never personally done, so I thought that would be a cool thing to do. So I've used a similar approach here and made a basic shape in foam, and then covered that in fake leather as well. Well, I've also got these small computer fans which run on 5 volts, so I'm figuring I can have a couple of these in the mask, and that's going to allow me to breathe easily, and also hopefully it's going to be quite warm, I think, so that should help me keep cool. And these things are 5 volts, like I said, so they'll run off a USB power supply quite easily. So I've also got this mesh, so I'm going to cut that out and use it as a grill for the outside of the fan. So I'm now turning my attention to a harness to hold all this stuff together, and I'm using the same approach that I did for the foam piece. I've got some bent aluminium strips inside this webbing, so this is brown webbing that I've got off eBay, and I've got some parachute harness attachments. Now something I did, which I had mentioned before I think a few years back, I actually did it before the pandemic, was to build this sort of flight like a rocket pack for my flight mask that I made a few years back. Now what I did for this was literally literally buy a parachute harness off eBay, and I got some 1940s webbing, which I think is from World War II, and I replaced all the green camo with the World War II stuff just to give it a bit of a retro look. I then attached that to my rocket pack, and the reason I did this was because the breathing units that power the mask and allow me to breathe when I'm wearing it have a tendency to fall down my back on the previous version, and that meant that the tubes were pulled taut and your head would be sort of pulled back when you were wearing it. So I wanted to have those like right up on my shoulders, so I had plenty of give in the tubes. So I made this entire thing to allow that to happen. This worked really, really well. I was very pleased with this actually. This whole costume looked pretty good, I think. Didn't get many pictures of it, but here are a few from the parade on the Sunday. So I decided to use some of the cast-off parts from this for the main costume that I was working on. Now the piece in the chest is another version of the sort of arc reactor thing I also made a few years back. I made several of these at the time, some of which were half finished, some of which were a bit more complete. So I figured this could be a nice centerpiece for the piece as well. Something I wanted to have was lots of cabling on this, even on the previous foam version. And what I'd done was to buy a load of airbrush hoses, which can be had quite cheaply. And they look pretty good as sort of period cabling because they're covered in fabric rather than plastic. So I'm going to sort of build up a piece using all of those parts. Now something I also needed as well was a knee pad for the shin guard section. So what I've done is to take one of my previous skull casts and I've just put some more tentacle detail on this and given it a surround as well. And I just cut that out in plastic and then sculpted some detail into it. So I'm just making a quick mould of that and I'm going to cold cast those up as well. And I'm just doing this using exactly the same process as I did for the shoulder and shin guard pieces as well. Right, so initially looking pretty good, so I can now come over and give this a go on a polishing wheel. And yeah, very happy with that. It's quite shiny and looks pretty cool I think, so that's going to look pretty good as a knee pad for the armour. So once I had my cold cast pieces in place, I need to make some leather surrounds just to neaten the piece up and also to hold those sections in place. So I cut out a load of pieces of real leather in this case and I dyed that up, and I just created a sort of nice finish for those sections. So this is where we are so far, and I've got all of the pieces connected together. I've got a sort of a power unit on the back using the cast from the pressure vessels that I had, and I've basically made a wooden section here, covered it in styrene plastic and then just given it a spray of green car paint, and I've just dressed it up with various bits and pieces that I had left over from various previous steampunk projects. So I think that's looking pretty good. You know, I quite like that sort of arrangement. And then cables from that will come up to this unit on the side and they connect to the gas mask. So also need to put some final details on the shoulder pad. So what I've done is to use some casts of these skulls that I made again for a previous project, and they're just a quite nice way of adding some additional sculptural detail on there. Well, so there we go, so I think that's looking pretty good. Now something I should mention that I've had a problem with previously is this stuff tarnishes because it's well, it's basically real metal, although it's mixed with resin, but there's real brass in it, and that means it can tarnish and lose its shine over time. So a comment on one of my videos said that using something called Renaissance wax was the way to prevent that happening. So it creates a barrier between the piece and the atmosphere and stops it corroding. So I got some of that and gave it a go, and so far it does seem to be the case that this is working pretty well. Funnily enough, I was talking to Greg from Darkbox, someone I've featured on one of the videos before. They do authentic Victorian photography, and it turns out he uses Renaissance wax to wax the plates of his photographs as well. So it's got quite a lot of applications for sort of preserving things, but yeah, it seems to work rather well for cold casting. Alright, so that's it. So I hope this was interesting. I know it's been a bit sort of all over the place, but hopefully seeing how I put this together and sort of the problems I faced was interesting to some degree. And I'm really just glad to be doing a little bit more steampunk again, really. I mean, obviously because of the pandemic, I hadn't touched this in about 3 years, so it's nice to have an event to actually work towards, and I'm sure there'll be some more steampunk pieces on the channel in the future. But for the time being, I think that's it, so thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.